Yue, should we go ahead and begin?
Oh, yeah, okay. Do you see my slides? Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending our symposium, Universality and Universality and Diversity in Event Cognition and Language. So we know that people can rapidly segment and organize their continuous experience into events. And at the same time, people talk about events by encoding event information into language-specific lexical and syntactic structures. So our symposium is centered on the question how event cognition interacts with event language. And we explore this question through cross-linguistic and multimodal approaches. So in our symposium, we have 4 talks. The first one is the shared semantic role prototypes across 3 Germanic languages. And in this talk, it's about the cognitive primitives for linguistic event roles. And the second talk is multimodal encoding of events in speech and gesture guides visual event apprehension. So this talk is about language effects on event processing. And then we'll have the talk of case marking influences visual event apprehension, and do cross-linguistic spectral differences affect event individuation. So the 2 talks discuss whether language differences, the language differences and the potential correlates in event cognition. So this is just a brief introduction, and I think now we can start the talk.
Okay, so let me introduce, hi, by the way, I'm Ercenur Ünal, one of the co-organizers. So our first speaker is going to be Lilia Rissman. So over to you, Lilia.
Great, thank you so much. All right, thank you to all our in-person and virtual attendees. And I'll remind our in-person audience that if you want to look at any of the presenters when you are asking a question, the camera is behind you. Okay, let's go ahead and begin. So consider the following event. When we're just looking at this event or hearing a sentence describing this event, something like Beyonce smashed a car window with a bat, we represent the individuals in this event in terms of abstract event roles, which are often called thematic roles. So in this case, Beyonce is the agent, the car window is the patient, the thing being acted upon, and the bat is often called an instrument, the tool that's used to perform the action. And these types of thematic roles play a really important role in linguistics and cognitive science. So they've been argued to be universal, and they've been argued to be domain general. So the same representations underlying event cognition and event language. Now, we know that there's a lot of diversity, cross-linguistic diversity, cultural diversity, in how these roles are expressed. So something that's really important to the idea that they may be universal is that they are represented in terms of prototypes. So most notably, kind of most influentially, the work of David Dowdy. So what does it mean for these roles to have prototype structure? So in Dowdy's approach, if we have an event like the one on the left, where we could say something like a sentence in English, the red dot guy kicked the blue dot guy, how this works is that we have an argument structure of kick, where the individual who kicks maps to subject in an active clause, and the one who is kicked maps to object in an active clause. And the reason that there's this mapping between the roles and the grammatical positions of subject and object is because of proto-properties. So the individual in this event that is the best agent, kind of most prototypical agent, having properties like acting intentionally or causing the event, that's the one that's getting mapped to subject. And I've argued that even though there's a lot of cross-linguistic variability in this domain, that the role prototypes themselves may in fact be universal. Okay, so the program of understanding, do these thematic roles have a universal status? How much are they explaining in language and cognition? It's important to test beyond agent and patient roles because we know we represent events in terms of many different types of participants and many different entities. So I'm interested in pursuing the question, beyond agent and patient, is instrument a universal role concept, where the instrument in that example was the bat? It's plausible that instruments may be a universal event and language category because using tools is culturally universal and is an essential part of our material culture. And the ability to use tools has been evolving for a really long time. So Homo habilis 2 million years ago was developing the ability to use tools. So this is a plausible candidate of something that could be universal. What is an instrument? What is this category? So with thematic roles in general, there's a lot of fuzziness and uncertainty about what might be a member of this category, where are the boundaries of this category. So if we consider this first event, here if we think about the role of the hammer, you might think like, okay, yeah, that's an instrument, yeah. How about this one? When we think about the role of the elbow, is the elbow an instrument in this event? Here, when we think about the role of the cutting board, is the cutting board an instrument? And finally, the role of the blue cylinder, which is kind of an intermediary between the train track and the ball. Is that an instrument? Is that part of this category, or is it something completely different? So we know, kind of complicating this question about what are the boundaries of this category, we know there's a lot of cross-linguistic variability in this domain, as with other thematic roles. So here's just one example. So there's this contrast between English and Russian. So we have this Russian sentence, which is a translation of "the woman smashes a plate with a hammer." And here the hammer is marked with instrumental case, but that's the same case marker that you get in the second sentence, which is a translation of "the nut was cracked by Constantine." So in English, when you have the passive agent, that's marked with a different morphosyntactic marker. You can't say "the nut was cracked with Constantine" to mean passive agent. But it's Russian instrumental case does have that correspondence. And this type of cross-linguistic variability is widespread. But we actually need look no further than English to see variability in the types of meanings that different instrumental markers express. So in some of my previous work, I've noted this contrast between English with and English use, which are both taken to introduce instruments in English. So with, on the one hand, permits an unintentional agent. So if you have an event where Mia trips and accidentally cuts her dress, you could say Mia cut her dress with the scissors, but it sounds a lot worse to say Mia used the scissors to cut her dress, where this little hash mark indicates infelicity. So there's a contrast there. Use kind of needs an intentional agent. In contrast, use is kind of doing its own special thing, where it permits a non-causal instrument. So let's say we have an event where Nigel is chopping lettuce on his desk, like he's like, I have to make this salad, in between meetings, I'm just gonna chop this lettuce on my desk. You could say Nigel used his desk to chop the lettuce. It sounds a lot worse to say Nigel chopped the lettuce with his desk. Okay, so different meanings are getting encoded even within a single language. All right, so given this variability, is instrument just like not a thing? Like this is not a category that's helpful for us in linguistics and cognition? Well, okay, we've observed that with, use, and Russian instrumental case have different meanings, but it still might be the case that they share the same prototype. And despite decades of research on thematic roles and looking at instrument in particular, there's a lot of documentation across languages about what the instrumental markers are, but this particular question has not been addressed in a systematic way. That's what I'm doing today. So what might be the prototypical instrument? What I hypothesized in this study is that the prototype is a tool, and we understand tool in terms of defining an entire event. So what a tool event is, an event where the entity being acted upon is a physical object wielded by an intentional animate agent, playing a causal role in the event, and causing a change of state in a patient. So this event here of a woman smashing a plate with a hammer has all of these properties of being a tool event. And I formulated this definition based on the literature on animal tool use, kind of when researchers in that framework think about, yes, an animal is using a tool under these circumstances, it's according to this definition. Okay, so my question today, for semantic structures expressing instrumentality in English, Dutch, and German, are tool events most prototypical? If they are, this is evidence that thematic roles are stable across languages. And English, Dutch, and German are both linguistically similar and relatively culturally similar relative to the broad scope of human culture. So to the extent that we find different patterns and different prototypes for these three very similar languages, that gives us evidence right out of the gate that maybe there's a ton of variability here and that maybe there isn't an instrumental prototype. Okay, so in this study, people described 50 events. So tool events, like you saw. These three other types of events, which we saw examples of, so someone using their body, or where the actor is inanimate, like the train track, or where the it's playing a causally indirect role, like the cutting board. There were a variety of other events as well, which I'm going to come back to. So the predictions are, if tools are most prototypical, then in a video description task, we predict that people will produce instrumental terms like with and use and corresponding terms in Dutch and German more often for tool events than for these other events. And in a sentence acceptability judgment task, people will rate sentences with the instrumental terms as more acceptable for tool events than for other events. So we're looking at both what people would produce as well as what they would accept as being good descriptions. Okay. So in this task, in the video description task, people saw each video, so you've already seen this one, and before they saw the video, they saw a still image where a couple entities in the video were highlighted with red circles. So we told them, you can describe this video any way that you want to, but you need to mention the entities in red circles in your description. And the reason we did this is that we know from previous work that people often don't mention instruments because they're syntactically optional, they're kind of maybe more backgrounded in event cognition in general, but we wanted to know, like, what is the language that they're using for these things? So we kind of like prompt them to describe them. And in each video, there was a target where we were like, how are they talking about the target? So here, the target is the board. How are they talking about the board? And the way that we coded, so here is a sample description. The girl chopped the carrot on the chopping board. So we're looking at what is the lexical item that the target is a complement of. Here, the chopping board is a complement of on, so what we coded this description as a on trial. So the term is on. By contrast, the woman used the chopping board to chop up her carrot. Here, the term is use. And we tested British English, Dutch, and German speaking adults. Okay, so back to this variety of events. Because this is a lot, I'm going to kind of break this down into a couple pieces. So first, I'm going to show you these kind of focus on the results for tool, body part, and this additional event called a no state change event. So let's take a look at this little video here in the corner. Okay, so she's tapping the cat on the head with a wand. These are identical to tool events, except that the patient doesn't undergo a change of state. Okay? So for this first pass through the data, I'm going to pull out these three conditions, and the others will be averaged as just other. Okay, so here's what we found. On the y-axis is we have the proportion of trials where people used instrumental terms in their descriptions. What we see here, big gap between the three colored bars and the gray bar. So for these other ones, people didn't use these terms very much. But importantly, for the tool, the no state change, and the body part events, people were equally likely to use instrumental terms like with and use. And this is incompatible with our prediction that the tool is the prototype, because tool events weren't actually more likely to elicit this language than body part events or no state change events. Okay, turning to the acceptability judgment task, they saw the events again. They saw either the prepositional variant of the instrumental sentence, like a woman cut up the carrot with a chopping board, or the periphrastic variant, like a woman used a chopping board to cut up the carrot. And they rated this on a scale from 1 to 6. We tested adults online. And here are results. We see a really similar pattern as the production results, where these sentences for these three conditions are rated much more felicitously in both frames than for the other sentences, or for the other events. We see a really similar pattern across the three languages. We don't find that the acceptability judgments are higher for tool events than for the no state change and body part events. Again, incompatible with our prediction, with our hypothesis that tools are the most prototypical. Okay, so what we see emerging is the prototypical instrument that's shared across English, Dutch, and German is these three events, the tool events, body part, and no state change events. And what is jumping out here, kind of the most important semantic feature, is the importance of agency. The idea that what an instrument is, prototypically, is an extension of an agent. And that kind of makes sense of why the body part events are looking just as prototypical as the tool events, because, you know, when I use my body to do something like my elbow to smash a cupcake, that is kind of quintessentially the most direct extension of my agency. So that seems to be the most important feature that's coming through in English, Dutch, and German. Okay, but English, Dutch, and German were not identical. So here I'm going to pull out this additional scene, means of transit events. So here people saw an event of someone planning a trip on Google Maps. So here taking the train from London to Edinburgh, and they were told, describe this as if you took this trip yourself. So I'm going to pull out tool, means of transit, and average the other ones, the kind of other. Okay. So we see here, now we see a big difference between the languages, where in Dutch and German, it's fine to use met and mit, the kind of translational equivalents of English with, to talk about taking a train. So in English, it's not so good to say, you know, I went there with a train, but that is the standard way of talking about this in Dutch and German, to say you met a train. And see a very similar pattern for the acceptability judgments as well. So for English, there is a significant drop-off in acceptability for both the use sentences and the with sentences. We don't see that drop-off in Dutch at all. And for German, we only see that drop-off for the use sentences. So variability across these languages as well. Okay, so to wrap up, the common proto-instrument that we see, kind of highlighting the idea that what an instrument is an extension of an agent. Important question going forward, of course, is how common is this prototype across languages? It could well be the case that this particular prototype is shared. It could also be the case that if we looked at a much larger set of languages, it would really only be the tool events themselves that are shared. However, it could be that languages take really different approaches to categorizing this space. We can imagine languages that take a more mechanistic categorization of the space, such that in that event of the train track knocking over and hitting the blue cylinder, those would pattern more prototypically because that is a causal intermediary. So it could be about different aspects of event structure might be more or less relevant. And it's an important question going forward whether this prototype, even just for speakers of English, Dutch, and German, is reflected in event cognition independently of language. So like if you did a memory task and you were able to control for different perceptual aspects of the stimuli, would you find that these three events are kind of patterning together as people having the most robust memory, which would be a marker of prototypicality as well. Thank you very much. This work was just published in Cognitive Science if you want to check it out. Thank you to our funding sources. If you want to join our event cognition Slack, you can just use that QR code if you're a devotee and want to have more conversations with people who are interested in event cognition. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Lilia. So Lilia is going to help me with the questions in the room, but in case you're online and you'd like to ask your question, you could either raise your hand to ask it verbally, or you can put it in the chat if you want me to read it for you. So I don't see anything in the chat right now, but Lilia, is there anyone in the room?
Not yet.
Not yet. Then maybe can I ask a question from me? I mean, you kind of alluded to this in the discussion, but what do you think about the generalizability of this to other languages? Because as you mentioned in the beginning, Dutch, German, and English are quite related. But for instance, my native language, Turkish, also has this like specialized case marker for marking instruments. So what are your predictions about that?
That's a great question. You know, it's hard for me to, like, as far as literature, I don't think there's a great reason to think that, oh, yeah, like what English, Dutch, and German do is going to be the norm. You know, from some of the typological work that's been done about it, you know, some of the work of Balthasar Bickel on looking at case marking has found like that there really is no prominent clustering of case marking for instruments. It could be that instrumental participants are really, you know, that we seek, it's kind of more for the core roles like agent and patient that we see a lot of cross-linguistic stability, and for these other roles we see very little stability. I mean, I think that's completely a live hypothesis, and, you know, even though the way that English, Dutch, and German categorize this space seems very intuitive to me. Of course, I say that as an English speaker, so that really doesn't have much weight in terms of making predictions more broadly.
Thank you. Any other questions?
We have an in-person question. Hello.
Okay, thank you. Hi.
I really love this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a question about, maybe this is ill-formed, but you made people express instruments, right? Like that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
But if you ask me, what do you see, and you don't tell me that I have to explicitly name the hammer, I could also maybe say she hammered the plate, or she flew to London, or something like that, right? Yeah. And so I'm not doubting that what you found is real. Yeah. But it is real under these circumstances. So the instrument incorporation in verbs, for instance, if you had a completely free task, what would that change if you found that people actually incorporate the instruments a lot? Not even that they don't mention them, but if they verbally incorporate them. Yeah,
that's a great question. We addressed that exact question in the paper because it did come up in review. And we ran an additional study with English speakers where we didn't, where there were no red circles. And of course, people mention the instrument less often, but we were comparing what is the distribution of responses like, and is there more variability in the lexical items that are used as the term? And we did not find a difference. And we looked at these particular cases where there were 3 events where you could potentially use a denominal verb like hammer or paint. And there was no difference in how often people used those verbs, whether there were circles or not red circles.
Yeah, so that ties a little bit into my. Can I? Okay, my second question, which is when you went to further directions, right? Asking, are they actually prototypical across languages? It is quite unusual, right, to hammer a plate or to smash a cupcake with your elbow. So maybe the reason that I wouldn't actually say she hammered the plate is because I don't usually do that. But if I say she hammered the nail into the wall, that is the prototypical use of the prototype of the instrument, right? So I wonder if there's any way of teasing apart like the typicality of the instrument use and the syntactic prominence that you would expect.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, with more experiments, you know, like in this particular study, we're more interested in looking at types of abstract event features that have been looked at in the literature on prototypicality. So like, to what extent is there intention? To what extent is there causal directness? So we didn't manipulate typicality, but I think that's an important step because it could very well be the case that, you know, it's really the maybe like most typical tools that are kind of like really the best. That could be the case, yeah. And we just need to do more work to find out. So, yeah.
Thanks to the audience and to Lilia, but so basically the way we're going to do this is we'll have 15 minutes for each talk and then a couple of questions after each, but then there's going to be like a larger period at the end for more general questions. So I saw Anna's hand and then someone in the audience, so maybe you guys can keep your question to the end. Okay, so
Thank you.
next, thanks. So next, I'm actually going to be introducing myself. So let me share my slides. Okay. Can you guys see them okay? Oh, no, that wasn't necessary. I was thinking if I should share the sound, but that's okay. Okay, so and Yue, could you please keep track of time, especially for the questions for me? Thank you. So I'm going to be presenting some of our recent work on multimodal encoding of events and how it relates to visual attention. And as Yue and Lilia have already mentioned, basically perceiving events and communicating about them is one of our fundamental cognitive abilities. But one of the ways in which we communicate about events is also through our gestures. So one intriguing question is, how does the way we speak and gesture about events relate to the way we perceive them? So the idea that linguistic and non-linguistic conceptualization of events are tightly linked to each other, especially during message preparation, is very prominent in several theories, such as thinking for speaking and Pim-Leval's speech production model. So for instance, according to the speaking model, speaking begins with a pre-verbal apprehension of the broad details of an event that is later mapped onto a linguistic message, taking into account lexical and syntactic encodings, which later culminates into an utterance. And there's very wide support for this model by lots of eye tracking studies showing that while inspecting visual scenes, people allocate their attention to the scene in a way that maps onto their descriptions. But as I mentioned, language is a multimodal phenomenon, and the interface model extends these views about to the case of multimodal language production. So in this view, gesture production also requires similar kinds of conceptualization as speech production does. And a hypothesis that emerges from this view is that gesture production should also show similar links to event apprehension as speech production does. So our goal here is to rely on eye gaze behavior to test this proposal. And to do so, we're going to focus on motion events like this one. So we have a woman running into a phone booth, and motion events are composed of several important semantic elements. So we have a figure, that's the moving entity, which moves in relation to a ground object, following a certain way of moving, a manner, and a specific trajectory or path of motion. And languages also distribute information about these components to different parts of speech or syntactic phrases. So for example, in English, the manner of motion is encoded in the main verb, like run, and then path of motion is expressed in a prepositional phrase, such as into the phone booth, that is linked to that main manner verb. And languages also differ in how they express these components. So here I have an example from Turkish, which is a verb frame language. And here path of motion is mainly expressed in the main verb of the sentence. So something like enter, exit, or descend. And then manner of motion is either expressed in a subordinate verb, so a separate verbal clause, or sometimes omitted altogether. And it's important to note that these are not the only ways these two language categories encode motion. So there's some kind of within language variability, but nevertheless, they indicate the most typical and frequent ways. Now, there's a lot of work that has also shown that these linguistic patterns also map quite tightly onto visual attention patterns. So for instance, speakers of Greek, a verb frame language, tend to allocate relatively more attention to path over manner of motion. And then this kind of difference between path and manner is much less in speakers of English that tend to encode manner in the main of the event. And then finally, we also see tight links between language-specific encoding in speech and gesture when we look at multimodal language production studies. So for example, speakers of satellite frame languages that tend to express path and manner in a single verbal clause also tend to produce a single gesture that conflates path and manner. So they might produce something like this. Whereas speakers of verb frame languages that tend to distribute path and manner into different verbal clauses also produce two separate gestures for path and manner. So they might produce one for running and then another one to indicate entering or exiting. And because manner is expressed in separate verbal clauses outside of the main verb, they usually tend to omit manner gestures as well. So these similarities between how people speak and gesture have been taken as evidence for this interface model that I mentioned at the beginning. So in this view, we see these similarities because the linguistic conceptualization that underlies speech production interacts with this spatial motoric imagery that underlies gesture production. And due to this interface, we see similar speaking and gesturing patterns. But the evidence for this claim has been somewhat indirect because it relies on how people speak and gesture only. And there's not necessarily any evidence from the message preparation stage, such as eye gaze behavior. So here we wanted to test that. And before we did so, we first wanted to replicate and extend prior evidence on the links between speech behavior and eye gaze patterns. So first of all, we focused on speakers of Turkish, a single language, and then we looked at how different ways of encoding path of motion in speech relates to different kinds of eye gaze patterns. So even though these group level differences between verb frame and satellite frame languages have been demonstrated, variations within a single language have been explored to a lesser extent. And then once we establish or re-establish those links, we also wanted to see if there's further modulation of visual attention that is linked to gesture production. To test this, we recruited adult speakers of Turkish, and we gave them videos of motion events like the ones that I had just shown you. So participants watched these events while we recorded their eye movements. And then once the video stopped, they describe what happened in the video to an addressee who was sitting right across them. We included the addressee just to make the task more communicative, but the addressee didn't actually do anything. And then people described the event using their speech and if they wanted to, their gestures. So we also didn't give them any explicit instructions about gesturing or not. In terms of how people could express path or manner of motion in speech, so path could be expressed in verbs like enter, exit, descend, and approach, and so on, or outside of the verb in postpositional phrases. So something like towards the tree would be an example in Turkish or English. And then for manner of motion, they could use the more typical form, like using a subordinate verb like while running, together with a main path verb, or they could also use simple manner verbs like walk or run and so on. In terms of gestural encoding, so we coded path gestures as present if people use their hands or fingers to trace the trajectory of motion, and this had to also match the actual direction of motion in the video. And in terms of manner of motion, we coded it as present if people use their hands to depict how the figure moves. So they could use something like this to indicate running, or like move their finger up and down to indicate hopping or jumping and so on. For our predictions, basically, we focused on the relative attention to path over manner following previous work. And for the element encoded in speech and gesture, we mainly focused on path because this is coming from a verb frame language. And we basically expected people to allocate more attention to path over manner when they used a verb to encode path in speech, as opposed to when they encoded it outside of the verb. And then furthermore, we expected people to allocate even more attention to path over manner when they produced a path gesture. So first, we wanted to check that our participants were really speaking like we expected them to. So here is basically their speech data, and we saw that basically participants were more likely to use descriptions that included both path and manner, as opposed to manner only or path only descriptions. But importantly, the majority of their descriptions that included path included verbs. And then in terms of their gestures, again, in line with previous work, we found that people were more likely to produce gestures that express only path, as opposed to those that express both path and manner or manner only. So these kind of confirm our expectations about language-specific patterns. Next, we looked at the eye gaze patterns, and here the dependent variable I'm going to show you is the proportion of path minus manner fixations. So basically, if you see fixations above this dotted line, it means that people have a preference to look at path over manner. And then if you see fixations below this dotted line, it means that people have a preference for manner. And then the different colors of dots or lines are going to show different types of path encoding in speech. So red for path verbs, green for path outside of the verb in postpositional phrases, and then purple for no path encoding. So in these cases, basically, these are the manner only descriptions. And we basically compared first what happens when people encode path in either way, so the green and red lines, as opposed to when they don't encode path at all. And we see that basically they allocate more attention to path when they use either a verb or a postpositional phrase, as opposed to no path encoding. And in fact, when they produce the manner only description, they have a manner preference. And then second, we compared the two types of path encoding to each other, so the green versus red fixations. And here we also found that people had more preference for path over manner when they use a path verb, as opposed to when they did not, when they use a postpositional phrase to encode path. And then finally, we looked at the time course of visual attention in relation to gesture encoding. And for this analysis, we focused on a subset of the data where people encoded both path and manner in speech, because this was the most frequent pattern. And we just wanted to keep the semantic elements encoded in speech constant, so that whatever we see in gesture could really be attributed to gesture and not something else. And here, the two different lines are going to show you when people produce an additional path gesture. So these are going to be in yellow, and compared to cases when they do not produce any gestures at all. So the lines in blue. And here is the time course data. So as you see, confirming the previous analysis, overall people have a path over manner preference. But this preference is actually modulated depending on whether people produce a path-only gesture versus not. So people had even higher path preference, both at the beginning of the viewing of the event and also while they were towards the end of the event description, when they produced a path-only gesture, whereas this tendency was a bit lessened when they did not produce any path gestures or any gestures at all. And finally, we conducted a joint analysis that combined both whether or not people produced the path gestures to how they encoded path in speech. And we also see that taking into account this verb versus postpositional phrase, our gesture-related findings are actually still remaining significant. So these effects seem to be appearing on top of speech production. All right, so summarizing, we have seen a tight link between language-specific encoding of events in speech and gesture, showing that people were more likely to encode the component that's encoded in the main verb in gesture. We also replicated prior evidence on the tight link between linguistic encoding and speech and visual attention, and we extended by showing that within speakers of a single language, attention allocation also differs depending on how that semantic element is encoded, which also provides further evidence for the idea that verbs might be the main processing units of speech planning. And then finally, we show that as a novel contribution, visual attention to events is further guided by language-specific event encoding in gesture, and this extends the prior work on the speech domain to the gestural modality and provides evidence for eye movements for the interface hypothesis. So together we show that the kinds of semantic elements that can be packaged in one processing unit may guide both how we produce gestures and also how we allocate attention to events. Thank you all for your attention. And also this work recently came out in Cognition, where we report some additional findings as well. So please check that out if you're interested.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes for discussion.
Anna, hi.
Hi. Very cool. I really like the findings. I would like to ask about the relationship between the speech and the gesture domain. So you've shown us different graphs about different types of information, the way they're distributed. What about cases where you have both systems active and you have to apportion information across the spoken and the gesture domain?
Well, you mean basically like complementary gestures where
Yes.
one element, I think that would be actually an ideal case to really investigate the like to what extent these eye movement patterns come from like some kind of like joint modulation, or to what extent they come separately from gesture and speech. Unfortunately, adults like 95% of the time when they produce a gesture, this is coming from an element that they have already mentioned in speech. But I think there might be something different going on with children. So this is one of my future plans actually, because they tend to omit more elements. But because of like difficulties in packaging the information in speech and so on, I think we see more complementary gestures in children. So I think it would be really interesting to see these kinds of effects. Yeah,
absolutely. I think you're onto something there, because we've definitely seen complementary manner gestures, especially in kids who speak, for instance, Greek, which is a language like Turkish that doesn't encode manner in the verb so much. So there's a lot of gestures that help with the encoding. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we have a question in the room.
Yeah, maybe we can alternate. Yeah.
Sorry. That was, I don't know where to look. There was a really
it's behind you. That's what Lilia said. Hi, Eva.
I still have to talk this way. Anyways, so I'm very fascinated by this work. And one thing that I asked myself, which just shows my ignorance, is there must be languages that really like encoding manner more than path, right? Or maybe there aren't. I don't know. But what I ask myself is like, is the fact that people encode path more than manner just due to the fact that any manner gesture is going to be more complex than a path gesture, right? If you want to make a gesture, it's much easier to just indicate the direction, basically, than do this.
Yeah, I think that definitely we see more variation in how manner can be encoded. So some of them can be actually like really body mapped. So like this for running, I don't know if you can see my video, but this for running is like, it's much more embodied as opposed to like the trajectory of motion, like with it. So you really have to do some kind of mapping onto the hand, which I think is a bit more abstract. So it's interesting to see this kind of variation, but I'm not so sure if anyone has actually looked into this kind of variability in, like how information is packaged in visually, basically. Yeah, because I think some other people that have like that attribute like more importance and maybe even like a facilitative role to iconicity would also argue that the body map ones are actually a little bit easier to produce as opposed to the like more abstracted path gestures. Yeah.
Is there a question in the chat? Because we have another in-person question.
No, but
Okay,
do we
yeah.
have time?
Oh, I don't know.
We have about like 30 seconds.
This is a very quick question, just following up on Eva's last question. I'm wondering if there's, I don't know anything about the gesture literature, so I'm wondering if there's like lexical entries for gestures. So in like verb frame languages, we see more verbs of like manner. Is that a thing in gesture as well? Because speakers of different languages, I'm imagining gesture in different ways.
Yes, they do, but I think the general pattern is what you put in a single gesture differs in a way that's linked to how you speak, and what elements are linked to the main verb. So so basically, like what I mentioned at the beginning, like you might produce two separate gestures that encode only one element if you're a speaker of a verb frame language, whereas for Dutch speakers or English speakers, we tend to see both path and manner conflated into a single gesture. So you might do something like this, as opposed to something like this and this. Like two versus one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. All right. So now I think I should introduce our third speaker. I hope I don't pronounce your last name incorrectly, Arrate. I apologize in advance, but we have Arrate Isasi-Isasmendi, who's going to be talking about case marking influences visual event apprehension.
Thank you for the introduction, and that was a good pronunciation, actually. Well, better than average, I would say. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. You can see it now, right? Okay. So, hi everyone, and now in my talk, I'm going to tell you about our studies that show how case marking influences the apprehension of briefly exposed events. And for that, first, I will tell you about some studies on Basque and Spanish, and then in the last part of the talk, I will also mention some preliminary results from a study on Shipibo. But let me tell you first about the general background of this study. So agents and patients, as we already know, from the basic structure of events, and there's evidence, as Lilia has already mentioned, that these two agent and patient roles are abstract role categories, and that there is a universal bias to distinguish them. And actually, it looks like agent and patient roles are restricted during the apprehension stage. So Hafridal showed that the encoding of event roles is rapid and spontaneous. So even when the task doesn't require participants to obtain information on agent and patient, they still do it. Now, an interesting question in this context is whether the apprehension of agent and patient roles can be affected by language. And there is some evidence that indeed word order for sentence planning or recent linguistic experience can affect how speakers look at agents and patients in events. So for example, Norcliffe et al. Showed with telltale speakers that depending on whether they were producing verb initial or agent initial sentences, then the looks to agent and patients already changed in the first 500 milliseconds, actually. So given these findings, in our study, we set out to investigate whether case marking could also affect visual attention in event apprehension. And we were interested in case marking specifically because there's cross-linguistic diversity in how languages mark agents. Well, previously, Lilia has already mentioned that this is to be more consistent than for instruments, but there is still some variation. And to study this question, we compared two languages with different case marking systems, Basque and Spanish. And now I'm going to show you briefly what this difference is in Basque and Spanish. So here we have two event pictures, and one of them, we have two participants, an agent acting on a patient. So this would be described with a transitive sentence, and in the other picture, we just have one participant, and this would be described with an intransitive sentence. And here we see how this would be described in Basque and in Spanish. In Basque, the subject noun phrase ane receives the agent case mark. This K here is the agent case mark in Basque because it is the agent of the event here. And in contrast, in Basque in 2A, when describing the intransitive, the one participant event, here the noun phrase doesn't receive any agent case mark because this is not an agent. And in comparison, in Spanish, the subject case mark doesn't change. So in both of them, it takes the default, this is the unmarked case. There isn't any case mark to highlight agents. And the pattern that you find in Spanish is probably the one that you're familiar with in some of the languages you speak, for example, in English. And now, because in Basque, we have this case mark that highlights agents, our prediction for this study was that there would be higher visual attention to agents in Basque than in Spanish. And to test this, we ran 2 brief exposure experiments. The participants in these experiments were native speakers of Basque and Spanish. And the experiments were basically 2 versions of the experiment with the same basic design. So first we ran an online experiment with 87 and 85 participants in Basque and Spanish respectively. And then we took this experiment to the lab and we introduced eye tracking as well to see how participants fixated on the event pictures. And in this case, we had 28 and 24 participants in each group. The stimuli we used were event pictures, so still images. And there were 3 event types in this experiment. So we used 2 participant events where the agent was human and the patient was inanimate, for example, a man watering a plant. Then we also had 2 participant events where both agents and patients were human. And we finally also included 1 participant event that would be described with intransitive sentences. And we included these intransitive ones as feelers. So the ones that we were interested in were really interactions where there was an agent acting on a patient. This is what the trial structure looked like in our experiment. So first, participants would see a fixation cross, and then they would see the brief exposure picture. So they would see an event picture for only 300 milliseconds. And we chose this 300 milliseconds time frame specifically because we wanted to target and we wanted to tap into the event apprehension processes to the earliest time frame of visual attention. And the event picture could appear in one of the 4 corners of the screen. After that, participants would see a mask, and after the mask, they would have to perform a task. So there were 2 tasks in our experiment. First, there was an event description task, and in this task, they had to produce a sentence to describe the event picture. And then we also had the proof recognition task. And this was a non-linguistic task, or at least this task didn't ask the participants to produce any linguistic outputs. So in this task, participants would see a proof picture, and they had to answer whether this person or object in the proof was present in the previous event picture. So they would answer with a button press, either yes or no. So we measured fixations to event pictures in the in-lab experiment using eye tracking, and then we also measured the accuracy for both tasks and the reaction times for the proof recognition task. And this was for both experiments, for both the online and the in-lab versions of the experiment. And I will already jump into the results, because the main pattern of results that we found was that there was a higher visual attention to agents in Basque and to patient and action areas in Spanish. And this was reflected in the fixations, but also in the accuracy and reaction time measures in both experiments. And just as an example, I will show you now what the fixation results look like from the eye tracking experiment. So in this plot on the left, you can see first fixations to the event pictures, and these are grouped by agent, patient, and action. This is by the areas in the areas we had in the pictures, and they are also grouped by the language group. So in orange, you can see Basque, and in purple, Spanish. So there was a general tendency to look to agents first, and this was true for both Spanish and Basque speakers. But on top of that, fixations to event pictures were also more likely to fall on agents in Basque than in Spanish. Now, these language effects also emerged in second fixations to event pictures. In addition to first fixation, we also looked at second fixations. And in second fixations, well, we also saw that there was a general tendency to look at agents across the board. But then we also found that Basque speakers looked a bit more to agents than Spanish speakers, and the opposite was true for patient and action areas. Spanish speakers inspected patients and actions a bit more in these second fixations. So what we found in this, okay, there was a problem with, okay, you cannot see now, right? my slides like disappeared. But I think I can repair it quickly. Okay, I will go back to the slide I was in, and hopefully it won't happen again. Okay, I was showing you the fixation results, so I will share the screen again. Should be possible. Okay, you can see the slides again, right?
We can see them.
Okay, cool. So I was telling you that what we found in these two brief exposure experiments with Basque and Spanish was that first of all, there was a general bias to look to agents, and this was true for both tasks and for both language groups. And actually, the results I have shown before here in these slides are for both tasks, so for both Basque and Spanish. And yeah, so for both Basque and Spanish, for the event description and the proof recognition task. So we found these language effects in both tasks. So the first main finding was that there was a general bias for agents across tasks, so in both event description and proof recognition, and in both language groups, in Basque and in Spanish. But then on top of that, we found that attention was biased towards agent in Basque and towards patient and action in Spanish. And this seems to show that event apprehension can be affected by case marking. So case marking seems to have a top-down effect on how events are apprehended also in non-linguistic tasks, actually. Now, because we are interested in how case marking can influence the way speakers inspect agent and patients, and we don't want to just generalize from Basque and Spanish, then we also have a study on Shipibo, which is a language that also has a case mark for agents. And now in the rest of the talk, I'm going to tell you about this, about the results on Shipibo. So recently, one of the postdocs in the same project, Caroline Andrews, ran a pilot version of a similar brief exposure experiment with Shipibo. And Shipibo is a language spoken in the Peruvian Amazon. And Shipibo is notable because it has fewer exceptions to the agent case than most of the languages, although it does have some differences compared to Basque. So if you're interested in how Basque and Shipibo specifically use this agent case mark, you can ask about that later on, and Caroline and I will be happy to talk about that. Now, one of the reasons to run this pilot study was that we weren't sure if the 300 milliseconds presentation time would be a good presentation time for this population. So we tested 4 different presentation times, the same 300 as the one with Basque and Spanish speakers, but also the 600, 900, and 14 millihundred presentation time. And this changed the block structure from the Basque experiment, but the trial structure remained the same otherwise. And also I have to mention that in this experiment with Shipibo, we didn't have the proof recognition task, but only the sentence description. This is the event description task. And because we have longer presentation windows, we will now look at dwell times instead of first successions to the event pictures. And we will start with the 300 milliseconds presentation time condition. Now here we see a difference in fixation times where the deciding factor seems to be the case of the subject. So there's more attention paid to patients here in red. So there's more attention paid to patients for sentences that ultimately included the agent case compared to the default or unmarked case. However, we need to be very careful about drawing conclusions from this data because data loss was extremely high, unfortunately, in this presentation time condition. So up to 60, 56, 86%. So far, there isn't a whole lot of data that we can rely on this 300 milliseconds condition. But interestingly, when we look at the 3 remaining presentation times that we tested, we see a very different pattern. So first, there was no observation of the default case with an animate patient. So for a spare reason, we omitted that section of the plot. And then what we found was that there seems to be a consistent pattern of more looks to the agent with an inanimate patient, regardless of case. So only with animate patients are looks to the agents reduced here. And this is obviously in contrast to what we found in the 300 millisecond condition results, where their case appeared to be the deciding factor. And in contrast here, it doesn't seem to have such an effect. So what is the critical factor here? Is it just animacy that matters, or is it an interaction of animacy and aging case that is the deciding factor? Well, it turns out that there was an additional category of responses that can help us here. So when there were two animate, two human entities in the image, speakers sometimes use coordination, such as Maria and Kate are talking. And in Shipibo, this construction critically uses the default case and not the aging case. And for these sentences, the fixation results for coordination, they pattern more closely to the agent case and animate patient sentences, in having fewer looks to the agent and someone more looks to the patient. So in contrast to the earliest time window, 300 milliseconds, what we see in the later time windows is that animacy and not case is the factor that determines looking patterns. So the main ideas that we can get from this pilot study on Shipibo is that there are effects of animacy and case marking, but these two effects might change depending on the available viewing time. And another finding that we got is that when both agents and patients are human, there were more looks to patients, and that in the earliest time frame, this is when the presentation time was only 300 milliseconds, case seemed to be a deciding factor. Now, the general take-home message from the studies that I have been talking about, the ones for Basque and Spanish, and now the ones on Shipibo. So the general take-home message would be that the case marking influences the apprehension of briefly exposed events, although there seems to be differences depending on presentation times and also depending on the specific languages that you look at. And with this note, I want to finish my talk, also thanking all the project members and collaborators that took part in the study, and also thanking the research assistants that helped Caroline Andrews in her fieldwork in Peru. And that's on my side. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Arrate. So we have 5 minutes for questions.
Any in the chat?
No, Anna has a question.
Yes, thank you. This was an interesting talk. I would like to know a little more about the mechanisms that you envision that might produce these effects. If these effects can be replicated, could you talk a little bit about how you think language might create these effects on visual event apprehension?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for this question, because this is crucial, but we didn't have time to go that deep in this talk. So we think that the language effects are related to how sentence planning changes depending on whether you have to use a specific case mark or not. So in Basque, when you start planning a sentence, you already, to produce the first noun phrase, the subject, you already need to know whether that subject is going to be an agent or not. So this is a crucial information that you need to get early on. In Spanish, for example, you can just say the first noun phrase, and then it's not crucial whether this is an agent or not, because then this can change. So the first noun phrase is not going, the form of the first noun phrase is not going to change depending on whether this is an agent or not. And so this is something that changes the sentence planning mechanisms. And we know this already from some previous work in our team, where they also looked at Hindi, so sentence planning in ergative marked languages, and they compared to sentence planning in non-ergative marked languages. So this is how sentence planning could affect already event apprehension. Now, there's also the question of how this extends to non-linguistic tasks. And there we have been discussing quite a lot what would be the exact mechanisms that would drive these effects all the way into non-linguistic tasks. So there are different possibilities. It could be that language is somehow recruited, or language that the speakers are performing this non-linguistic task in a kind of linguistic mode, let's say. So language would be more or less recruited for that, or would be covertly used. We're still looking at very early time frames. So, but still, language can be, there's literature showing that language can be like automatically or very like quickly recruited. So this is a possibility. Another possibility would be that there are like long-lasting effects of language. The way you use case marking or not could affect how your perceptual processes are. So this would be like irrespective of language recruitment. So there are these like two main explanations, and we ourselves are still a bit divided into what exactly are the mechanisms driving the effect specifically for the non-linguistic task. For the linguistic task, we do have a good explanation and we're more or less convinced, but I think we need a lot more work to give like a detailed explanation to what happens in the non-linguistic task, where the effects come from exactly.
I have a question. Do we have a couple minutes?
Yeah, 2 minutes. Yes. Thanks.
Okay. Hi, this is really interesting. I have a lot of questions. I'll start with just a clarification. So the Basque and Spanish data that you showed, was that for the human-human condition? Was it just that condition? Or were you averaging the human-human, human, non-human?
Yeah, here we're in the plots that I have shown, and in general in the results I have talked about, this is all averaged across like the human-human and human object event types. We did find also some differences, right? So there were more fixations and the accuracy was higher where the patients were human compared to objects. But
yeah, I mean, it's not surprising that people would look more to the agent when it's animate, when that's the only animate thing in the video. But you still found the difference between Basque and Spanish when you were just looking at the human-human events?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was also the idea. That was the reason why we wanted to include both animate and non-animate patients to see whether the language effects would generalize across different event types. And we found that it did. Yeah, language effects still persisted in both event types. Yeah. Okay,
cool. And maybe we can take this next question in the, you can address it in the discussion period at the end. I didn't totally follow your explanation about to Anna's question about what's happening with the Spanish. I'm not an expert in Spanish, but the agent role, that's indicated through word order, right, in Spanish? So I didn't totally follow, maybe you can just say it again later, the explanation about why Spanish speakers are kind of less committed, kind of have to make less of a choice about how they're encoding the agent, because agency isn't expressed through case. I didn't totally follow that because it is expressed through word order. So it seems like they have to commit when they begin the sentence, but maybe I'm just not understanding.
Yeah, you're totally right. And they do have to also think about this because word order is also telling them about it. But yeah, I can talk about this and yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
This part related. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Arrate. So we are moving on to the last presentation by Yue Ji. On do cross-linguistic aspectual differences affect event individuation?
So now let me share my slide. Okay, can you see it? Okay, so now let me start. So events are broadly defined as temporal segments that are considered as having a beginning and an end. If we think about the case of climbing a mountain, conceptually, such an event begins when people start at the mountain foot, and the event comes to an end when people reach the mountaintop. And many studies have found the event endpoint is a critical and a salient component in event representations. For example, people could memorize and describe the endpoint, such as reaching the mountaintop, more accurately compared to the beginning in the motion event. Despite the salience of event endpoint, events actually differ in the way they come to an end. For example, in the case of fixing a car, the event begins with a car breakdown, and it comes to an end when the car starts working again. Such an event has a natural and inherent endpoint. It is bounded because it has a specific temporal boundary. Well, in the case of driving a car, the driver could stop driving at an arbitrary moment, and we need actual information to specify the endpoint. So such an event is unbounded since it doesn't have a specific temporal boundary. So in one of our previous studies, we found that people are able to form bounded and unbounded event categories after a brief exposure to examples of event classes. And also in a more recent study, we found when observing unfolding events, people spontaneously track event boundedness. Together with evidence from other studies, boundedness could be part of the primitive conceptual structure, conceptual representations of events. Then how the bounded and unbounded events are described are encoded in language. So language expresses the internal temporal structure of events, and a basic distinction is between telic and atelic verb phrases. The fix a car is a telic verb phrases denoting a bounded event. In contrast, atelic verb phrases denote unbounded events like driving a car, which don't have a specific endpoint. So telicity has been recognized as a semantic universal. In other words, almost all languages have ways to distinguish event descriptions, descriptions of events with and without a specific endpoint. However, languages differ in how telicity is encoded. And here we compare between English and Mandarin. So first, a brief summary about how telicity is encoded in English. So both the verb component and the direct object noun phrase contribute to telicity. We already looked at the case, the pair of fixing a car and driving a car. So some verbs denote actions that lead to a perceptible change of state in the object, and the endpoint is the resultant state. These verbs express telic meanings. In contrast, other verbs like drive denote activities that don't have a perceptible change of state on the object, and these verbs express atelic meanings. So apart from the verb component, the argument, the direct object, also matters for telicity. When the object is quantified, such as an apple, the verb phrase is telic. The endpoint is specified. In the case of eating an apple, the ending is when the apple is gone. When the object is not quantified, such as a bare plural form, apples, the verb phrase is atelic. For eating apples, the endpoint is unspecified. So now let's take a look at the situation in Mandarin. Similar to English, the verb component contributes to telicity of the verb phrase. Importantly, we have a contrast in the form. To express telic meanings, Mandarin has resultative verb compounds. Here, the Mandarin counterpart for the verb fix is actually a verb compound. So it has two components. The first component refers to the action, and the second component refers to the resulting state. Well, for atelic meanings, Mandarin uses simple verbs or the monomorphic verbs. Here, the Mandarin verb for drive is just it just has one component. And apart from the verb component, Mandarin and English are quite different in the direct object. Since there's no overt plural markers in Mandarin, bare nouns are grammatical and are actually widely used as a direct object noun phrase. And bare nouns are not specified for quantitative features. If we use a bare noun as a direct object, like eat apple, the default interpretation is atelic. It roughly means do some apple eating. To specify the quantity, we use the numeral. We use numeral and classifier as in the second case, to specify the quantity of the object. So to sum up, compared to English, Mandarin tends to have a more complex form for telic verb phrases. Specifically, they are resultative verb compounds instead of simple verbs. And also the numerals and classifiers are needed to specify the quantity. So if the telic verb phrases are more complex, the Mandarin speakers could be more inclined to use the simpler atelic verb phrases when describing events. So the first aim of our study is to explore how exactly Mandarin and English speakers choose between telic and atelic phrases to describe events. And the further question is whether the differences in event descriptions would have consequences in boundedness construals. So the first experiment is an event description task. We have 30 participants for each language group. We use two sets of video stimuli. One set includes bounded events, the other set includes unbounded events. The same two sets of stimuli were used in our previous studies, and we did several norming tests. Basically, the test could confirm that people considered the videos as having or lacking an inherent endpoint, respectively. Also, the English speakers indeed described the two sets using telic and atelic verb phrases, respectively. And this is a very straightforward task. So people watch a video clip each time, and then they describe what happened in the video in a full sentence. And then we, the descriptions underwent telicity diagnosis. Here I don't have time to explain the diagnosis, but I am happy to explain more in the discussion. And then we measured the proportion of target descriptions. So for bounded stimuli, the telic verb phrases are coded as target descriptions. And for unbounded stimuli, atelic verb phrases are coded as target descriptions. So here are the results. So from the figure, we can see that English speakers produced more target descriptions for bounded events than Mandarin speakers, as the blue bars show. And English and Mandarin speakers are not different in describing unbounded events. So to sum up, Mandarin speakers indeed used more atelic verb phrases than English speakers. And specifically, Mandarin speakers combined a simple verb with a bare noun, which resulted in an atelic verb phrase, even for describing a bounded event. So if we found the differences in event descriptions, in the second experiment, we explored how English and Mandarin speakers understand event bounded. And in this experiment, we have 40 participants for each language. And we use the same stimuli as in the first experiment. So we adopted the task is inspired by a previous study by Li et al. On objects construal. So participants are introduced to the distinction between an event and an activity. So here we didn't use the terms bounded and unbounded because they are unfamiliar to the participants. So we introduced the difference through the pictures and also through a brief explanation. For event, we highlight that an event has a natural endpoint, while an activity doesn't have a natural endpoint. Then participants watch video clips and rated the likelihood of thinking the video clip as an event or as an activity. So here is an example of a trial. People watch a video and then they circle from 1 to 7, and 1 means an event that has a natural endpoint, and 7 means an activity that has no natural endpoint. So here are the results. So from the figure, from the first slide, we can see there is little difference between English and Mandarin speakers. So both language groups considered bounded events as having a natural endpoint and unbounded events as lacking such an endpoint. So to conclude, we found, so here languages differ in encoding telicity, and as a result, speakers of different languages differ in their use of telic versus atelic phrases when describing events. Despite linguistic differences, English and Mandarin speakers have similar boundedness construals. So taking the results together, the cross-linguistic differences in encoding the telic-atelic contrast have little effects on how people represent distinction between bounded and unbounded events.
Thanks, Yue. So do we have anyone in the room? If not, then I have one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yue, so I think that the linguistic data you've shown is basically focusing on the target descriptions that you have sort of introduced to us. But is there a way that Mandarin speakers could mark boundedness or unboundedness using additional ways? So this reminds me a lot of evidentiality, like English speakers don't have to do the distinction in their grammar, but if they want to, they can certainly convey this information.
We don't have a grammatical marker, but I think the telic verb phrases are more marked because we have to use a compound, a verb compound, rather than a simple form. And also, we need to specify. We have to use the numerals and the classifiers to specify the quantity of the noun phrase. So together, the telic verb phrases are marked or more complex.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have in person.
Okay, so we can alternate between in person and then later on the question in the chat.
Okay. Hey, I think I'm going to take you up. There was a brief mention of explaining the sort of categorizing criteria in marking the English or Mandarin phrases as telic or atelic. And you said we could ask about it later, and I think I'm very curious about this, which is to say whether most of the differences were, or I'm just curious if there was an extreme preponderance of the differences were about the noun phrases themselves, and whether in English where a determiner is obligatorily expressed versus in Mandarin where it's not, is that explaining most of the difference in the use of atelic or telic phrases? Or is there also any difference that is maybe explained by the verb phrases? Because I think in English as well, there are verb phrases that you can express telicity by also compounding. So for instance, with adding a prepositional phrase at the end, you can eat apples or you can eat apples up. And that also, I think, implies telicity. And so I wonder if you saw any variation in terms of, how much of that variation is due to verb phrase versus the noun phrase itself.
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. We did check the use of the verb or the verb component, and also the noun phrase. So in the case of for Mandarin speakers, first the use of resultative verb compounds are rare. So that's the first reason for a low proportion of telic phrases. And also for Mandarin speakers, the use of numerals and classifiers are even more less they are also very rare. And so basically, almost all the descriptions are like the simple verb form followed by a bare noun. So that's why they are atypic. As for English speakers, we do find descriptions like eat up. It's kind of on top of, like, it's kind of emphasizing the endpoint and describing boundary events.
Thanks.
Okay, so there's one question in the chat, which I'm going to read. I'm also very curious about this. How would you systematically distinguish bounded and unbounded events? For example, the man drove a car. It was categorized as an unbounded event, but given its past tense, could it be seen as bounded because it ended in the past?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a question about, so the tense or like the grammatical aspectual system is different from here, the verb phrase and so on. And even, you know, like in the past tense, the man drove a car, it happened in the past, so it has an endpoint. Such an endpoint is not natural or inherent to the event. It ended in the past, but we need further information to specify the endpoint. So here we explore the internal structure of the event, whether it could or it has a natural potential endpoint, regardless of like the tense, whether it's in the past, in the present, or in the future.
Thank you. So any other questions? Then maybe we can move on to the general discussion. So we have about 13 minutes for that. Oh, yeah, 13 minutes for that. So I think some people didn't get a chance to ask their questions earlier. Or yeah, Anna?
Hi, I have a question for Lilia, but I think it's a question for anybody who studies events and their linguistic encoding. So I know towards the end of our discussion for that talk, we raised the issue of typicality and how whether an event component is typical or not might affect the rate of mention. So I wanted to mention here some work that my former student Mirto Grigoroglu and I did on how children and adults describe instrumental events. And it was building up on a classic work by Brown and Dell. And what we found and what they had found also in the past is that when people talk about instruments, they actually mention the atypical ones more, and they leave the typical ones unmentioned. So nobody says, he was stabbed with a knife, but people would say things like he was stabbed with an ice pick, because the ice pick is obviously more atypical. So I wonder whether, especially for the body part cases, you might get slightly different estimates or largely different estimates of instrument mention depending on the typicality of the body part. So it's, pressing a button with your elbow is very atypical. So people will say with his elbow, but if you did the same thing with your hand, I don't think people would necessarily say with your hand or with his hand, right? They would just say he pressed a button.
Yeah, I mean, that work is, the work that you've previously done, that was the exact reason why we had this manipulation with the red circles, where it's like, okay, we know that there are these pragmatic factors about, what does the person producing the utterance think that the some hypothetical person needs to know, and that has a huge effect on whether the instrument gets mentioned or not. We weren't interested in studying that. We were not interested in studying that in this event. We want to know, because a lot of these, it's like, yeah, the cutting board just doesn't necessarily get mentioned that much, but we still want to know, like, well, how do people linguistically encode the cutting board? And so we just have to be like, you need to describe the cutting board. So that was the reason. Mm-hmm. It's just, I think it was just different dimensions, different ways of understanding the complexity of events and how we think about them, rates of mentioning them is one window into, kind of in a spontaneous way, is one window into event understanding, but also looking at what are the linguistic descriptions that are used when people do mention them is another window into how they're categorized. As far as the body parts, I mean, I share your intuition that there has to be kind of a reason why, you know, if I knock this glass over with my hand, I don't know if you can see me, but there's a glass. If I knock it over with my hand, there has to be a reason why you would mention my hand. You know, maybe I just broke my hand, and so it's like, you know, salient that I'm using my hand anyway to knock over this glass. I completely agree that that is a factor leading to mention. So as far as, I think there's more work that we can do to kind of see, okay, are body parts really prototypical? Because, yeah, I agree that spontaneously, if they're atypical, they're not going to get mentioned as much. And I do think that is a piece of the story, just not one that we looked at in this study. Is that satisfactory? Okay.
I think there was somebody at the microphone, so maybe we can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi. Thank you, all the speakers. I actually have a question for all the speakers, I think. So the title of this session, I think, was Universality and Diversity in Language and Cognition. I think the diversity question in terms of like how speakers of different languages that encode events in different ways cognize differently about events, whether they do that or not. I wanted to ask you kind of a question from a different angle in terms of universality. So I think as people, those of us that think a lot about event language are maybe at a privileged state to think about non-linguistic event cognition as well. So in this session, we saw that, you know, languages, despite their differences, choose to encode certain things one way or another, like boundedness, telicity, instrumentality, agentivity, manner, path. These are things that languages encode one way or another. What do some of you authors think about what that can tell us about non-linguistic cognition? So why is it, for example, that languages choose to encode manner and path, and it's not the case that languages encode other things about motion, like whether you know, the agent hopped with one leg or two legs. That's not a thing that languages choose to encode. You know, what do these things that we find in language, what does that tell us about just like fundamentals of human experience and non-linguistic human cognition in general? Maybe it was like
anyone wants to start?
I can jump in, or anyone of our virtual presenters can comment.
Go for it, Lilia. We'll go next.
All right. I think this is like the question for me in my research, where it's like, there's so many dimensions of the world that we could choose to encode, like hopping on one leg versus two, versus now I have like one hand on the floor too, but that's just not something that like gets linguistically encoded in that way. Mm-hmm. So what is it about what guides the choices that languages make about what to pull out? You know, language is such an abstractor, really reducing the rich perceptual space of events into something much more limited, but then powerful for communication. What are the mechanisms that cause that kind of funneling? And how do we still account for all the linguistic variability that we see, given that there is all of this funneling? I don't know that this is like going to be such a satisfying answer, but I think that that's, you know, very much the purpose of trying to look at both like non-linguistic measures, like of event apprehension or memory, or kind of like in my work, trying to look really broadly at like what's happening with infants or what's happening with home signers, to try to understand what are the biases that, like, what are the things that seem to be really important in like conceptual knowledge or perception, and how is that influencing language? I don't know if that really addresses your question.
Yeah, it does. It's a really interesting discussion.
Maybe Arrate had her
Yeah,
unmuted. Yeah, and then we can go to
Yeah, so from our own work, what I could say here is that so we're mostly interested in agents, because precisely agents are something that you don't find so much variability. So we do have languages that have this case mark for agents, right? But this is not so common to find it across languages. It's not something that you find like incredible amounts of diversity. And but we were still interested in studying these languages and this diversity in agents, because we thought that this precisely could tell us about like a general cognitive bias that exists, right? If there is such like if there isn't so much diversity in how languages encode agents, that's probably because these agents are like so special for the cognition, and probably one of the like the most important aspects of events. And related to that, I think whenever we present language effects on event cognition or even apprehension, such as the ones I've been talking about, I think it's also important to highlight what are the aspects that are common across language groups. So for example, we did find like a clear preference for agents, like in both language groups. We test like irrespective of the specific language features of in each case. So we found a preference for agents, also also when the patient was animate. So I think it's also like worth it to highlight that we do find like some general trends. And for agent, this is easy to find because it seems to be like the most clear example, right? Like there is like this agent preference across the board. But I'm sure also there's like these other like biases that are like the conceptual ground where language is all kind of built in.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then Anna?
Let me just say, also that the idea that things that get encoded systematically across languages are important for human cognition is a very old one. And so in some sense, we're all looking cross-linguistically to identify these things that are shared and that are important for human cognition. It's also not an accident, probably, that a lot of these concepts have been the kinds of concepts that people look for in human infant studies are sometimes directly inspired by the things that languages encode. So in the case of events, things like in, on, and under, things like sources and goals and so on are very much present in human language. I think moving forward, it would also be a great idea to look for cases where there are divergences between human language and cognition, where language cares for certain dimensions that cognition may track in different ways, or language, as was already pointed out, forgets or glosses over certain dimensions that experience encodes in a very fine way. So I think given everybody's background here, it's really great to be looking for homologies, but there are also cases where the priorities of the two systems diverge, especially since most of us are looking at language from a production point of view. Right? We're not just looking at language structure, we're looking at language use, and language use is a communicative act and it has its own constraints. And so it can only give us a snapshot onto the kinds of things that languages care about.
I have a question for Erce and Arrate.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of, when you were both presenting, I was thinking about how do you reconcile the results that you see. So like with Erce, it seems like something that's really important as far as event apprehension, an eye gaze is kind of figuring out what verb am I going to use, the kind of that the structure kind of pivots around what type of event is this, how is that getting encoded in the verb. And then with Arrate, we see sort of a different pressure where it's how is the agent getting, like speakers of Basque, their agent gets a special marker, so there's kind of like some attention is paid, maybe a little extra attention paid to the agent. Not saying that they're inconsistent, but sort of how do you think about these pressures working together and in different ways for different languages?
Yeah, just to like clarify, I think in like my events, maybe also because like we show them for longer, I guess like there might be different like inferences we can make from the paradigm, but we never, the data I showed you never includes the looks to the agent. And I think when we also looked at this, the first fixations are also in my case are also landing on the agents of my events as well. So I think in that sense, like there might be like even some similarities. And the data in terms of how or what the verb encodes is it might be driven from like the later fixations and so on. So that's like my way of reconciling this. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah, and what I could add just quickly is that the events we used in our experiments were like very prototypical transitive events, and we only looked at the first two fixations because we only had this 300 milliseconds presentation time. But probably if we had events where they could encode like different aspects of events because there was variability, or if we had longer presentation times, then we could probably like compare it better to the results that Archie has shown here.
So officially, time's up, but there's one more question in the chat, so I can just read it. It's for the whole panel. The work here has focused on relatively flat events like she ate some apples, which have boundedness and telicity dimensions. I wonder how individuals cognize about these dimensions in hierarchical event cognition.
Was the word flat?
Relatively flat. I guess meant like simple, or like one thing happening at a time. Yeah.
Oh, is this a contrast with hierarchically structured events like making dinner, which have many, many? Okay, all right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me just say really quickly that the events we're all looking at have been relatively ignored in the literature on event segmentation that has typically looked at precisely these more complex cases. And so I think because of our interest in language and cross-linguistic differences, we really wanted to zoom into the units of event representation and to the smaller bits that we tend to express in verbs or organize in clauses and so on. But I think your question is great. And I think at some point we do want to go beyond these very simple and mostly lab-based events and really look at events as they occur out there in the world and their messiness and complexity, and ask about how these results might generalize there. I do expect that dimensions that are as fundamental as the dimensions we've all been looking at within this panel would translate, even when we're looking at more complex representations. But it's a really interesting empirical and theoretical question how these findings would carry over beyond the confines of the present work.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I wish there was more connection between the kind of work that you've seen today in this panel and work on event segmentation, which often does look at these bigger hierarchically structured events. I think a factor here is that, events can really be construed in a lot of different ways. So an event of you see someone walking around in their kitchen, what are they doing? Are they washing dishes? Are they picking up a towel? Are they making dinner? There's lots of ways of construing what's happening. And, if you're interested in event roles, like I am, it's important to use stimuli where it's kind of unambiguous what the agent is. So I think maybe that's one reason why there hasn't been as much attention to hierarchically structured events, which by their nature can be construed in different ways and sort of with different verbs and, different agents, different kind of properties of the agent.
Thank you. I get the impression that we're supposed to leave because now the screen sharing is kind of like disabled. And also we don't want people to be late for the keynote after this. So thanks everyone for great questions and great presentations.
And thanks to our organizers as well.
Yeah.